The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, crisp white paper with the embossed logo of the Riverfront Dance Academy. I held it in my trembling hands, already knowing what it contained, but hoping against hope that I was wrong. The words swam before my eyes. After careful consideration, we regret to inform you that you have not been selected for our advanced company program. We encourage you to continue pursuing your passion for dance at a level more appropriate to your current abilities. My name is Jessica Miller, and that rejection letter became the catalyst that changed everything. At 19, I thought I understood how the world worked. I believed that talent, dedication, and countless hours of practice would eventually pay off. I believed that if I worked harder than everyone else, if I sacrificed more, if I wanted it desperately enough, the dance world would have no choice but to accept me. I was wrong about almost everything, but I was right about one thing. I did want it desperately enough to fight for it, even when fighting meant starting over from nothing. Growing up in Alton, Illinois, dance opportunities were limited. The nearest serious training was an hour drive to St. Louis, which my single mother, Linda, made 3 times a week after her shifts at the courthouse where she worked as a clerk. She never complained, never made me feel guilty for the gas money or the expensive pointe shoes that needed replacing every few months. She simply drove, sometimes falling asleep in the waiting room during my classes, her work clothes wrinkled from the long day. I started late by serious dance standards, 8 years old, when most professionals begin at 3 or 4. But what I lacked in early training, I made up for an obsession. While other kids were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, I was in our garage practicing grand jetés and fouettes in front of a mirror my mother had hung on the wall. I turned our basement into a makeshift studio, complete with a bar I constructed from PVC pipe and floor-to-ceiling mirrors from a hardware store clearance sale. By high school, I was dancing 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when competitions approached. I won regional awards, earned scholarships to summer intensives, and caught the attention of several college programs. When I graduated, I had 2 choices: accept a partial scholarship to Southern Illinois University, where I could study dance while earning a degree in something practical, or take my chances with professional training programs in Chicago or St. Louis. I chose practicality, which led me to SIU and eventually to that white envelope that would reshape my understanding of how dreams work in the real world. The Riverfront Dance Academy in St. Louis was considered the premier training ground for professional dancers in the Midwest. Their company program was selective. Only 12 dancers chosen each year for intensive training that often led to contracts with major companies across the country. I had auditioned twice before, each time making it to callbacks, but never quite crossing the finish line. This third audition felt different. I had spent the entire summer preparing, working with private coaches, refining every aspect of my technique. My arabesque was higher, my turns cleaner, my artistry more mature. I walked into that studio on audition day, feeling like I belonged there, like this was finally my moment. The audition process spanned 3 days. Day 1, technique class and basic combinations. Day 2, variations from classical ballets and contemporary pieces. Day 3, improvisation and personal interviews. I excelled in every phase, or so I thought. Other dancers stumbled through combinations I executed flawlessly. I nailed variations that left others looking confused and underprepared. During the improvisation segment, I felt a creative flow that seemed to captivate even the stone-faced panel of judges. But the letter said otherwise, and the letter was final. That evening, I sat in my dorm room staring at the rejection notice, trying to decode what had gone wrong. My roommate Sarah found me there 2 hours later, still holding the paper, tears dried on my cheeks, but my expression blank with shock. The next morning, I called my mentor from high school, Mrs. Thompson, who had guided me through those early years of serious training. Her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before when I told her about the rejection. "Jessica, honey, sometimes the most talented people don't get chosen. Sometimes it's about politics, about connections, about fitting a certain image or profile that has nothing to do with your abilities as a dancer." Her words stung because they suggested that all my preparation, all my mother's sacrifices, all those hours in the garage might not be enough. They implied that there were forces at work beyond my control, gatekeepers who made decisions based on criteria I couldn't influence through hard work alone. 3 weeks later, the Riverfront Dance Academy announced their new company members on social media. I studied their photos obsessively, analyzing their technique, their backgrounds, their connections to the dance world. What I found was a pattern that made my stomach turn. 8 of the 12 selected dancers had trained at elite studios in major cities. 7 had parents who were former professional dancers, dance teachers, or connected to the arts in significant ways. 9 were from families wealthy enough to afford private coaching, international summer programs, and the kind of training opportunities that simply didn't exist in places like Alton, Illinois. Only one selected dancer came from a background remotely similar to mine, and her social media revealed that she had recently moved to St. Louis from New York, where she had trained at one of the most prestigious academies in the country before her family relocated for business reasons. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about talent. This was about access, about networks, about systems designed to perpetuate themselves by selecting people who already had advantages. I had been competing in a game where the rules were invisible to me, but obvious to everyone else. That night, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. Instead of accepting defeat or trying again next year with the same flawed strategy, I decided to understand the system well enough to beat it. If the traditional path was closed to me because of circumstances beyond my control, I would create a new path. I spent the rest of that semester researching everything I could about the dance world's infrastructure. I studied funding patterns, analyzed company rosters, tracked the career paths of successful dancers. What I discovered was both discouraging and illuminating. The dance world, for all its talk about artistic merit and pure talent, was as stratified and exclusive as any other elite profession. But I also discovered something else. The system was changing slowly but inevitably. Audiences were demanding more diversity, more authentic voices, more stories that reflected the reality of American life rather than the narrow slice that had dominated dance for decades. Social media was giving artists direct access to audiences, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. Grant organizations were actively seeking to fund projects that challenged the status quo. There was an opportunity in all of this disruption, but only for someone willing to work outside the system rather than within it. During winter break, I drove home to Alton and spent hours walking along the Mississippi River, thinking about what I wanted to build. The idea that eventually emerged was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. I would create a dance company that actively sought out talent from non-traditional backgrounds, that provided the kind of training and opportunities typically reserved for the privileged few, and that produced work addressing the real experiences of people like me. I called it the Heartland Contemporary Dance Project, and it began with nothing more than a notebook full of ideas and a determination to prove that talent exists everywhere, even in places like Alton, Illinois. The first challenge was funding. I had no family money to draw on, no connections to major donors or arts organizations. What I had was a story and a willingness to tell it as many times as necessary to anyone who would listen. I started with small local grants, the kind that economic development councils and community foundations use to support emerging artists. The amounts were modest, $500 here, $1,000 there. But they added up to enough for me to rent practice space in an old warehouse downtown and begin holding auditions. The response surprised me. Within 6 months, I had identified 15 dancers from across Illinois and eastern Missouri who had been overlooked, underestimated, or excluded from traditional training programs despite obvious talent. They came from small towns, working-class families, and diverse ethnic backgrounds that had never been adequately represented in professional dance companies. Our first piece, Overlooked, premiered in the basement theater of a community college in Belleville, Illinois. We sold 43 tickets, but one of those tickets belonged to Robert Shun, an arts journalist from St. Louis who had heard about what we were attempting through a friend of a friend. His review in the alternative weekly paper was glowing, calling our work a necessary correction to the dance world's most entrenched biases. That review changed everything. Within a month, we had requests for additional performances. Regional arts organizations began inviting us to participate in showcases and festivals. Most importantly, word began spreading through the network of excluded dancers that there was finally a place where talent mattered more than pedigree. By our second year, we were performing regularly throughout the Midwest and beginning to attract attention for national publications. Dance Magazine ran a feature story about our company, focusing on how we identified and developed dancers who had been passed over by traditional institutions. The article included photos of our dancers mid-performance, their faces showing the intensity and artistry that established companies had somehow failed to recognize. But success brought its own challenges. Traditional companies began reaching out to recruit our dancers, offering contracts and opportunities that we couldn't match. I watched several of our most talented artists leave for prestigious positions with established institutions, taking the training and confidence they had gained with us, but leaving our company weakened by their departure. This exodus forced me to evolve our model. Instead of simply training dancers and hoping they would stay, I began developing a network of interconnected programs. We created youth outreach initiatives in small communities throughout Illinois and Missouri. We established partnerships with colleges that wanted to strengthen their dance programs. We developed touring productions that could be mounted quickly and inexpensively, allowing us to reach audiences who had never seen professional contemporary dance. Most importantly, we began documenting everything we did. Every dancer we worked with, every piece we created, every performance we mounted was recorded and archived. We were building evidence of our impact, creating a case study that other organizations could replicate. By year 3, we had grown from a scrappy startup into a recognized force in the regional dance scene. Our annual budget had increased tenfold. We employed 8 full-time staff members, and our performances regularly sold out theaters throughout the Midwest. We had also begun attracting national attention from foundations and grant organizations interested in supporting innovative approaches to arts education and community development. It was during this period of growth that I received a phone call that brought my journey full circle. The voice on the other end was familiar. Margaret Williams, the artistic director of the Riverfront Dance Academy, the same institution that had rejected me 4 years earlier. Her tone was professional, but carried an undertone of something that might have been desperation. She explained that the academy was facing significant challenges. Their enrollment was down, their donor base was aging, and they were struggling to remain relevant in a changing cultural landscape. She had been following our work and was impressed by what we had accomplished. We're looking for ways to diversify our programming and reach new audiences, she said carefully. I wonder if there might be an opportunity for collaboration between our organizations. The irony was not lost on me. The institution that had deemed me unworthy of their advanced program was now asking for my help to solve problems that their exclusionary practices had created. I told her I would consider her proposal and call her back. That night, I walked along the same stretch of Mississippi riverfront where I had first conceived of the Heartland Contemporary Dance Project. The conversation with Margaret Williams had stirred up emotions I thought I had resolved years earlier. Part of me wanted to say no immediately, to let the Academy face the consequences of their short-sighted policies. But another part of me recognized that this could be an opportunity to create change from within a system that desperately needed reform. I spent weeks considering the offer, consulting with my board members, dancers, and advisors. What eventually emerged was a proposal that would benefit both organizations while maintaining our core mission and values. Instead of a simple collaboration, I suggested a comprehensive partnership that would fundamentally restructure how the Academy identified and developed talent. The partnership agreement took months to negotiate. I insisted that the Academy adopt our open audition process, which actively sought dancers from non-traditional backgrounds. I demanded that they provide full scholarships for students who couldn't afford their programs, funded through a combination of their existing resources and grants that we would pursue jointly. Most importantly, I required that they hire several of our company members as faculty, bringing diverse perspectives into their traditionally homogeneous teaching staff. The Academy's board initially balked at these requirements, particularly the demands related to scholarship funding and faculty hiring. But their enrollment crisis was severe enough that they eventually agreed to all our conditions, recognizing that partnership with us offered their best chance for institutional survival. The announcement of our partnership generated significant media attention. Dance publications ran feature stories about the collaboration between the insurgent organization and the established institution. The narrative arc was compelling. The rejected dancer who built her own company was now in a position to reshape the institution that had excluded her. But the real test would come in implementation. Changing institutional culture is far more difficult than negotiating partnership agreements, and the Academy had decades of embedded practices that privileged certain types of students over others. The first joint audition session revealed the depth of the challenge we faced. Academy faculty members, despite their stated commitment to diversity, exhibited unconscious biases that influenced their evaluation of dancers. They consistently rated technically proficient students from traditional backgrounds higher than equally talented dancers who brought different aesthetic sensibilities or cultural perspectives to their work. This led to difficult conversations and mandatory bias training for all faculty members. Some resisted these changes, arguing that artistic standards shouldn't be compromised for social goals. Others embraced the opportunity to expand their understanding of what excellent dancing could look like. Gradually, the partnership began producing results. The Academy's student body became noticeably more diverse, not just ethnically, but in terms of socioeconomic background, geographic origin, and artistic perspective. Their performances became more dynamic and culturally relevant, attracting younger audiences and generating positive press coverage. Meanwhile, the Heartland Contemporary Dance Project continued expanding its reach. We established satellite programs in 5 additional cities, created an online training platform that reached students in rural communities throughout the Midwest, and began offering professional development workshops for dance educators who wanted to adopt more inclusive practices. Our success caught the attention of other institutions facing similar challenges. Universities, community colleges, and professional companies began seeking our consultation on diversity initiatives and community engagement strategies. What had started as a response to personal rejection had evolved into a movement that was reshaping dance education throughout the region. The breakthrough moment came during our 5th anniversary celebration. The event was held at the Peabody Opera House in St. Louis, a venue that represented everything I had once aspired to but thought was beyond my reach. The evening featured performances by current Heartland dancers, Academy students, and several alumni who had gone on to prestigious companies but returned to participate in our celebration. The audience that night included Margaret Williams and other Academy board members, arts journalists from national publications, foundation officers who had supported our work, and hundreds of community members who had followed our journey from the beginning. But the people who mattered most to me were sitting in the front row: my mother Linda, Mrs. Thompson from my high school, and several other mentors who had believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. As I stood backstage watching our dancers perform pieces that told stories of resilience, determination, and transformation, I thought about how far we had all traveled from that Tuesday morning when the rejection letter arrived. The scared 19-year-old who had opened that envelope could never have imagined the path that rejection would ultimately open. After the performance, during the reception, Margaret Williams approached me with an expression I had never seen from her before, one that combined professional respect with something that looked like genuine admiration. "Jessica, I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "When we rejected your application 5 years ago, we made a mistake. Not just about you specifically, but about our entire approach to identifying talent. What you've built here has shown us how much we were missing." I looked at her for a long moment before responding. 5 years earlier, an apology from her would have meant everything to me. Now it felt like confirmation of something I already knew, that their initial judgment had been flawed, but that their flawed judgment had ultimately led me to something better than what I had originally sought. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, "but I want you to know that I'm not angry anymore. That rejection led me to build something that has had more impact than I ever could have had as just another dancer in your company program." She nodded slowly, seeming to understand that this wasn't just about personal vindication, but about systemic change that benefited far more people than any individual career success could have reached. 6 months later, I was driving through downtown St. Louis when I saw it. A massive billboard advertising our upcoming season. My face looked down from 30 feet above the street, alongside the faces of 4 other company members, with text that read, "Heartland Contemporary Dance Project, where talent finds its home." I pulled over and stared at it, not out of ego, but out of amazement at how completely the narrative had shifted. The billboard represented more than personal success. It symbolized a fundamental change in how the dance world thought about talent, access, and opportunity. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my former college roommate who had witnessed those early days of rejection and determination. "Saw the billboard on my way to work. Remember when you thought your dance career was over? Look at you now." I smiled and put the car back in drive, thinking about all the young dancers in small towns throughout the Midwest who would see that billboard and realize that their dreams didn't have to be limited by their zip code or their family's financial situation. The face on that billboard looked like them, came from a place they recognized, and had built success on terms they could understand and aspire to replicate. Later that week, I received an email that brought the transformation full circle. It was from a 17-year-old dancer named Emily Rodriguez from a small town near Springfield, Illinois. She had been following our company's work and wanted to audition for our youth program. Her message included a detail that made me pause. She had been rejected by 3 different pre-professional programs, told each time that she had potential but needed more training before she would be ready for serious consideration. Her story sounded familiar. Her determination reminded me of myself at that age. Her talent, based on the audition video she submitted, was undeniable. I called her that evening, and we talked for nearly an hour about her goals, her training, and her experiences with rejection. When she asked if I thought she had a real chance at a professional career, I told her what I wish someone had told me at her age. That talent is just the starting point, that success requires persistence and adaptability, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is create your own opportunities rather than waiting for others to recognize your worth. 3 months later, Emily moved to St. Louis to join our program. She lived with a host family we had arranged, trained 6 days a week with our company, and attended classes at a local community college. Her progress was remarkable, but more importantly, her presence enriched our entire organization. She brought fresh perspectives, boundless energy, and a hunger to succeed that reminded all of us why we had started this work in the first place. Watching Emily develop as an artist, I realized that the true measure of our success wasn't the recognition we had received or the institutions we had influenced. It was the number of young people like Emily who would never have to experience the kind of rejection that had once threatened to derail my dreams. It was the expansion of possibilities for talented individuals who happened to come from places and circumstances that the traditional dance world had historically ignored. The Billboard came down after our season ended, replaced by an advertisement for a luxury car dealership. But by then it had served its purpose, not as a monument to personal achievement, but as a symbol of institutional change that would outlast any individual career or company. Today, 7 years after that rejection letter arrived, the Heartland Contemporary Dance Project has become a nationally recognized model for inclusive arts education and community engagement. We operate programs in 12 cities, have trained over 300 dancers, and have influenced policy changes at dozens of traditional institutions. Our alumni dance with major companies throughout the country, but more importantly, many have returned to their home communities to establish their own programs, extending our impact far beyond what we could achieve directly. The dance world still has significant work to do in terms of equity and inclusion, but the conversation has fundamentally shifted. Programs like ours are no longer seen as alternatives to traditional training, but as essential components of a healthy, diverse artistic ecosystem. Young dancers today have options and opportunities that simply didn't exist when I was starting out. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the Riverfront Dance Academy had accepted me into their program 7 years ago. I might have had a successful career as a company dancer, performing beautiful works and bringing joy to audiences throughout my professional life. It would have been a good life, a fulfilling life. But it wouldn't have been this life, and this life has touched far more people than any individual performance career could have reached. The rejection that once seemed like the end of everything turned out to be the beginning of something larger and more meaningful than I could have imagined. If you're reading this story, chances are you've faced your own rejections, your own moments when gatekeepers told you that you weren't good enough but didn't fit their vision of success. I want you to know that those rejections don't define your worth or limit your potential. Sometimes they're just redirecting you towards something better than what you originally sought. The key is to understand that talent without opportunity is just potential energy waiting to be released. If traditional pathways don't recognize your abilities, your job isn't to change yourself to fit their narrow criteria. Your job is to create new pathways that allow your talents to flourish and, in the process, make it easier for others like you to follow. The dance world told me I wasn't good enough to join their ranks. Instead, I changed the dance world itself. The Billboard is gone, but the changes it represented are permanent. And somewhere in Illinois tonight, a young dancer who might have been overlooked by traditional programs is preparing for tomorrow's class at one of our studios, getting ready to tell her own story of transformation through movement. That's the real victory not proving the gatekeepers wrong, but making their approval irrelevant by building something better than what they were guarding in the first place. The ripple effects of our work continue to expand in ways I never anticipated. Last month, I received an invitation to serve on the board of the National Dance Education Organization, a position that would have seemed impossible to attain through traditional pathways, but became available because of the alternative route I had carved. The invitation letter noted that they were specifically seeking board members who had demonstrated innovative approaches to expanding access to dance education. During my first board meeting in Chicago, I sat in a conference room surrounded by artistic directors from major companies, university department heads, and foundation officers, the very gatekeepers who once would have dismissed someone with my background. But the conversation had shifted entirely. They weren't talking about maintaining standards or preserving traditions. They were asking questions about community engagement, discussing strategies for reaching underserved populations, and sharing concerns about the long-term sustainability of institutions that failed to evolve with changing demographics. When they asked for my input on a new national initiative to identify and support emerging dance organizations, I thought about that 19-year-old who had opened a rejection letter 7 years earlier. She could never have imagined sitting at this table, not as a supplicant seeking approval, but as a recognized expert whose innovations were being studied and replicated across the country. The initiative we developed that day would provide seed funding and technical assistance to grassroots dance organizations in communities that had been historically underserved by professional dance programming. It represented exactly the kind of systemic change that individual career success, no matter how spectacular, could never have achieved. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. During a break in the board meeting, Margaret Williams approached me with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The Riverfront Dance Academy wanted to establish a permanent endowment fund that would provide full scholarships specifically for dancers from non-traditional backgrounds, and they wanted to name it the Jessica Miller Fellowship for Emerging Artists. I was genuinely stunned. The institution that had once rejected me now wanted to attach my name to their most progressive initiative, creating a permanent legacy that would benefit generations of dancers facing the same barriers I had encountered. When I finally found my voice, I told her that I was honored, but had one condition. The fellowship couldn't just provide financial support. It had to include mentorship, professional development, and pathways to leadership roles within the dance community. I had learned that access without agency is insufficient. Young dancers need more than just the opportunity to participate. They need the tools and support to eventually transform the institutions they enter. She agreed immediately, recognizing that this comprehensive approach was exactly what made our partnership successful. The fellowship was announced 6 months later, with an initial endowment of $2 million raised from donors who had been inspired by our collaborative work. The first Jessica Miller Fellows began their training this fall. Among them is Michael Thompson, a 17-year-old from East St. Louis whose raw talent had been overlooked by every program he had auditioned for until he found us. His story reminded me so much of my own journey that I decided to take a more active role in mentoring him personally. During one of our weekly conversations, Michael asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. He wanted to know if I ever regretted not becoming a traditional company dancer, if I ever wondered what my life would have been like if the Academy had accepted me 7 years ago. I thought carefully before answering. The truth was complex and required acknowledging both loss and gain. I told him that there were indeed moments when I felt the absence of experiences I would never have, the thrill of performing leading roles in classical ballets, the camaraderie of a traditional company, the validation of succeeding within established structures. But I also told him about the different kind of fulfillment that comes from building something meaningful from scratch, from creating opportunities for others that didn't exist before, from knowing that your work has expanded possibilities for entire communities of talented individuals who might otherwise have been overlooked. Most importantly, I explained that success isn't always about getting what you originally wanted. Sometimes it's about discovering that what you build in response to disappointment is more valuable than what you initially sought. Michael nodded thoughtfully, and I could see him processing this idea. He was facing his own rejections from traditional programs, his own moments of self-doubt about whether his dreams were realistic. But he was also surrounded by evidence that alternative pathways could lead to extraordinary outcomes. That conversation crystallized something I had been thinking about for months. The story of the Heartland Contemporary Dance Project wasn't just about overcoming personal rejection or building a successful organization. It was about the broader question of how society identifies and nurtures talent, and how those systems can be improved to serve everyone more effectively. The dance world's transformation over the past 7 years reflects larger changes happening across many fields. Industries that once relied on exclusive networks and gatekeeping institutions are being disrupted by technology, changing demographics, and evolving cultural values. The organizations that thrive in this new environment are those that embrace diversity not as a social obligation, but as a competitive advantage. This shift has created opportunities for people like me, but it has also created responsibilities. Having gained influence within systems that once excluded me, I now have the power to either replicate those exclusions or actively work to prevent them. The choice seems obvious, but it requires constant vigilance and intentionality. Every hiring decision, every program design choice, every partnership negotiation becomes an opportunity to either perpetuate historical inequities or create more equitable alternatives. This is exhausting work, but it's also deeply meaningful because the stakes extend far beyond any individual organization or career. When I look at the current roster of Heartland Contemporary Dance Project company members, I see the future of American dance. They come from 12 different states, represent a dozen different ethnic backgrounds, and bring artistic perspectives that couldn't have emerged from traditional training pipelines. Their work is technically excellent, but also culturally relevant, addressing themes and telling stories that resonate with contemporary audiences in ways that classical repertoire alone cannot achieve. This diversity isn't just aesthetically pleasing or politically correct. It's artistically essential. The most compelling dance being created today emerges from the intersection of different cultural traditions, different movement vocabularies, different ways of understanding the relationship between body and emotion. Companies that continue to draw from narrow talent pools are limiting their own artistic potential, regardless of their stated commitment to excellence. Excellence, I've learned, is not about conformity to established standards, but about pushing those standards forward through innovation and fresh perspectives. The billboard that featured my face last year has been replaced, but the message it represented continues to spread. 3 other organizations have adopted our training model. 2 universities have restructured their dance programs based on our community engagement strategies. A documentary film crew spent 6 months following our work, creating a feature-length film that premiered at the Chicago International Film Festival and is now being distributed nationally. But the most important measure of our impact isn't media coverage or institutional recognition. It's the individual stories of transformation that happen quietly, away from public attention, in small studios and community centers throughout the Midwest. There's Marcus Williams, a 19-year-old from Decatur who had never seen professional contemporary dance before attending one of our outreach performances. He's now in his second year with our company and has been accepted to summer intensives at three major institutions that actively recruited him after seeing his work with us. There's Ashley Rodriguez, whose family moved to Illinois from Mexico when she was 12. She had trained in traditional folk dance, but had never imagined that her cultural background could be an asset in professional contemporary dance until she joined our youth program. She's now developing an evening-length work that weaves together Mexican folk traditions and contemporary movement in ways that honor both without diminishing either. There's David Chun, whose parents wanted him to focus on academics rather than pursue dance professionally. Our scholarship program allowed him to continue training while maintaining his pre-med studies, and he's now completing his undergraduate degree while performing with our company. He plans to become a physician who uses dance as therapy for patients recovering from injuries or dealing with chronic conditions. These are the stories that matter most to me, because they represent the multiplication of possibility that happens when barriers are removed and talent is nurtured regardless of its packaging. As I write this, sitting in my office overlooking the Mississippi River that has been constant throughout this journey, I can see the lights of St. Louis in the distance. 7 years ago, that city represented everything I wanted but couldn't access. Today, it represents a partnership between old and new, tradition and innovation, exclusion and inclusion. The transformation isn't complete, may never be complete, because systems change slowly and require constant attention to prevent backsliding. But the direction is clear, and the momentum is building. Young dancers today have opportunities and support systems that didn't exist when I was starting out. The next generation will have even more. Sometimes people ask me what advice I would give to young artists facing rejection or exclusion from their chosen fields. My answer is always the same. Don't let other people's limited vision limit your possibilities. If existing institutions can't see your value, build new institutions that can. If traditional pathways are closed to you, create alternative pathways that work better for everyone. This isn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It's about expanding the definition of excellence to include perspectives and talents that have been historically overlooked. It's about building systems that serve everyone more effectively than the ones they replace. The rejection letter that arrived 7 years ago represented the end of one dream, but the beginning of something larger and more meaningful. Today, as I prepare for our 8th season and plan our expansion into 3 new cities, I understand that the most important question isn't whether I was good enough for their world. The question is whether their world was good enough for the future we're building together. Thanks for listening to this powerful story. Subscribe for more stories about the surprising ways people change our lives for the better. See you in the next story.